everyone, welcome to Business Television India. I am Siddharth Zarabi here from sunny Davos, and with me Sanjeev Kishan, the chairperson of PwC India. Thank you very much for joining us. Sanjeev, PwC has done a very detailed mood of global CEOs survey and almost over 4,400 CEOs globally. The headline really from that was from last year's record optimism to record pessimism now. What is the mood of Indian CEOs specifically within that survey, what was captured?
Yeah, so I think from India's standpoint, there is better news actually, because 57% of Indian CEOs are actually quite sanguine about the India opportunity over the next 12 months, while a bunch of them are not so considerate about what might happen in the global economy, because they believe that there are challenges over to geopolitical tensions and inflationary trends, etc., and potentially a recession in some of the global markets. But they are actually more sanguine about the India opportunity. 57% is a better number. And India is one of the territories where the CEOs are a lot more buoyant about India's opportunity. I think that's the first news. The second one, which is a watch out really, is that 40% of the Indian CEOs that were surveyed also believe that that their businesses, unless they were to reinvent their businesses, could not be in a position to deal with the next 10 years, which means that they may not even exist in 10 years if they don't re-energize their business over the next 10 years. And I think that is a very important statistic.
Sanjeev, what is this typewriter moment for Indian industry? Just as typewriters got phased out, which sectors in India are likely to face such a moment?
So I think it is actually across the board, if you ask me, and that's really happening because when you talk to them, there are three segments where people seem to be quite focused on. One is really the broad energy transition that's happening. Clearly, that's a focus at this point in time, and 72% CEOs are actually focusing on it. India is a capital-starved market. In some ways, if you need capital providers are saying that you need to focus on energy transition. So that's one thing which is happening. I think the second one really is the whole focus on supply chain transformation, which is all about nearshoring, at least making sure that you are able to de-risk your businesses. And I think that's the second transition which is happening. And the third one really is the transition which is happening on the workforce. Whether it is about what model to follow, people are still working from home, and whether we want to get them back in offices or a hybrid model follows, or how are they going to be dealing with all the technology and the transformation that they have done over the last few years, which means that there is a certain amount of upskilling that is required to be done. So these three broadly are, I would say, common to India Inc. These three kind of focuses are broadly common across India Inc. I think where there are certain differentiation is if you speak to a consumer business, and I'm also talking about not just a survey, but my own conversations over the course of last year, about 200 conversations that I had with CEOs. If you look at consumer businesses, they are a little bit more concerned about what's going to happen in the near term, because they believe that particularly rural markets and others, that there are concerns that are emanating. While some of the others are a little bit more buoyant. I mean, we have seen that there has been an uptick really in some of the construction activity, real estate activity. The financial services sector is doing reasonably well, which we always say is a barometer of the economy. But I mean, there are certain sectors, like for instance, as I said, the consumer sector. People are talking about the funding winter in the whole technology space. I still believe that good businesses are getting funded out there, but some of those possibly have a bleaker near-term view.
Okay, I want to take up this point about the transformation very briefly before we move on to a question about sectors. In terms of transformation, 30 years back, Indian industry had to undergo a painful transition where foreign capital and foreign companies came back, and that was the beginning of a new global trade order. We've seen a technology related, and now over the last 2-3 years, Indian industry has realized that foreign dependence and global supply chains also have a downside risk. You're now adding technology to the mix in terms of a challenge, and if you agree with that, how prepared is India and Indian companies actually in terms of the technology risk? Because a lot of these technologies come from outside, products are developed outside, and they might pose a challenge. Or do you see Indian industry being quick on the uptake?
No, I think I think it's a challenge that they are dealing with quite well. They're very cognizant of the challenge. See, it might emanate outside, but it gets delivered from India. I mean, who has the ability to deliver at the scale, the transformation, the technology transformation across the globe than India? And that is why some of the large IT majors continue to outperform, right? I mean, we have seen those numbers, right? I mean, the quarterly results are just out.
And our large IT majors are all over the Davos.
All over promenade. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think they are doing quite well in some ways. Yeah, I mean, they may, as I said, they may emanate outside. They may be conceived outside. I mean, transformation, which is related to AI, ML, etc., etc. I must tell you that, in the course of the last 3 days, I met at least 3 technology startups from India whose business models I really like, and I've just met them at forums, etc. And they have some brilliant ideas. So it's not as if that it's just coming from outside. Actually, some of that is actually coming from India, and I'm absolutely proud of that.
You spoke about funding, Winter, and because you said startups, I'm interrupting you here. Will access to capital and valuations be an issue in 2023? A vast majority of opinion says yes, and in fact, if you see at year-on-year fund flows, private equity flows, they have dipped significantly, less than half.
Yeah, so I mean, see, I would say this, that valuations will be definitely turning softer. At the same time, I think this is a very good phase for some of these businesses because it gets you to focus back on your business economics, which is what we have been saying forever. And I think it's good actually if the Me Too funding goes away because unfortunately at times that gets us a bad name. I mean,
That's
at times,
a good word, Me Too funding.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fear of missing out, right? For a capital provider also, maybe then you end up investing in the 5th or 6th or 7th person in the category, and in times like this, it becomes too many, right? And some of that money will not really find any takers eventually, and you cannot possibly exit that money, and that gets India a bad name. So I think the consolidation of that is happening within the segment. Also, there is consolidation. I think there is consolidation. I mean, we have seen certain consolidation happening in the past also when people like Myntra and others merge. So I think some of that might again happen again. The consolidation phase of the portfolios will happen, and some of that actually may be driven by the private equity funds themselves. But good businesses, I do not think will struggle. And we have seen that already. We have now people have been talking about funding went over 9 months. I can tell you that good businesses are getting funded. It's not as if they're not getting funded. If they need, first of all, they're very well capitalized. The good businesses are really well capitalized. They possibly don't need the money because they don't want to dilute at lower valuations. But if there is a business which needs money, has a good business model, and we're focusing on business economics, I can tell you that'll get money.
Supply side keeps coming up, and one of India's efforts on the supply side has been an initiative to become Atmanirbhar when it comes to not potato chips, viewers, but semiconductor chips.
Yeah.
How do you see that? There have been some announcements, but on a very broader scale, how is that effort shaping up? Because there has been some commentary that it's running a little late than what it should have ideally been.
See, some of these things obviously take some time to because we have never really focused on it. I mean, I think the semiconductor bus was missed by India in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Unfortunately so.
Absolutely, and it went somewhere else. And now we're sort of trying to get technology and competence from there, and which is fine. I think it's just the way it has happened. So some of these things will take time. These are mega projects. I think the good news is that there is significant amount of incentivization which is currently available from both the central government and indeed the state governments. I mean, I can only say this, that when I speak to many states, etc., there is almost competitiveness amongst them to get some of these projects into their regions. And I think this is a good time for anybody who's willing to take that bet to put up a plant like the one that you said. I mean, it in some ways helps. The Atmanirbharta thing, and the import dependence actually goes down. And who knows? I mean, these are critical inputs to some of the industries which can be export heavy for India. So that actually can make India a producer to the world also over a period of time. So I think these will take time, but I'm quite certain that some of these projects will over a period of time see the light of the day. Unfortunately, it's not like a click of the button. These will take time.
These will take time. You're part of a global firm that works throughout the world. What is India's place in the industrialized world? What do you sense, not just here from Davos, but because of your own professional experience? Because this is a question that many people ask us. We get compared with China. Some people say we should be closer to perspective, where do we stand today?
I think the world recognizes India's ability to provide them significant talent across sectors, not just IT but beyond that. I think that is fairly well recognized, and not just for people.
And this is not coolies.
No,
No, because this is what is said uncharitably, and I have to ask you that this is not just coolies, right?
no. I suppose look at the captives industry. I mean, there are so many Fortune 500 companies which already have captives, and so many more which are being encouraged by various people to set up captive centers in India. I mean, if cost bases are going to go up in places like Europe and indeed the US because of inflationary trends and others, people will look at their businesses because cost optimization, which our survey also says, is a big theme. Now, cost optimization for some of them will mean that I need to, set up a shared services center or something. Where will they go? They'll come to India. I think one of the things that I would say is that India could actually do is to make sure that we don't have just English-speaking kids and graduates, but also people who speak, let's say, German and Spanish and Mandarin, because then we will be even more desirable to some of these global corporations who want to set up shared service centers.
If anybody who runs an engineering college, computer science course, please take what the chairperson of PwC India is saying. Don't just focus on English. I have tried personally as well to provide non-English exposure to my children, but I can tell you that's not so easy.
I mean, we need to have an ecosystem for that, so that needs to be enabled.
Okay, I'm going to also ask you about 2023 and the new trends that might shape India's economy and the way Indian companies do business. You touched upon it in terms of the move towards sustainable energy. What will 2023 bring in front of Indian business that they'll have to reckon with?
So I think the transition areas that I mentioned to you at the outset, I think those are fairly critical. I think some of the large corporations will deal with them better because and I think they really need to be ambassadors, not only for themselves, but when you look at their supply chains and when you look at their distribution chains, etc. In some ways, they need to be ambassadors to make sure that their customers, their suppliers, all of them are also embracing that change. So I think that is one critical one I think that they'll have to deal with. And let's be candid, there is a cost of greening. There is a cost to climate change transition, if I may call it so. And that cost will in some ways have to be better dealt by some of these more mature organizations. There is also funding which is going to be eventually available. I mean, the government of India is going to be raising some green bonds, as we know, etc. And there is going to be some funding which is going to be available for this transition to happen. But yes, it is going to be costly. I think that's the one big thing, and we should budget those in. I think we should also be looking at scenario planning, because if the business is going to be volatile because of geopolitical risk and others, we cannot have just one business plan. We possibly need to have 2 or 3 business plans in some ways. We should need to scenario plan that, okay, if this happens, I need to go this way. If this happens, I need to go this way. I think last 2 or 3 years when COVID hit us, all of a sudden, has made Indian businesses more adapt to dealing with unknown changes.
Absolutely.
But 2023, they might come even faster, and we will need to be prepared for it.
Who knew there would be something like work from home or work from office or a hybrid version of that? Sanjeev, you mentioned the government and the budget.
Yeah.
And therefore, as we wind down this conversation, I have to ask you about priorities that should be there for the budget, but more importantly, straws in the wind, which seem to indicate that the finance ministry may make a move on rationalizing, making uniform, or doing away with the difference between long-term or short-term capital gains, taxation treatment. How significant is that issue?
So, I think the capital gains issue, I mean, it's been talked about for a fairly long time. I think there are obviously, as a taxpayer, it's quite confusing actually. The number of slabs that we have even on the long-term capital gains and of course short-term. So that of course is something on the works, but I'll not comment on it any further. But I think on the priorities, I think the good news is that I believe that we should be in a good fiscal space 2023, March 23, because from what I read, all the budgetary estimates we are actually running ahead on collections and all that. So much so that we haven't had to use any of the asset monetization, etc. I suppose a lot of that will happen in 23-24, and that should be in a way that's a buffer that we have. GST collections and others, etc. have already been helping us. I would think that the capex spending has to continue. because we still would need support. I think the public sector is going to be pivotal to sort of capital spending revival, and the private sector will actually look at the public sector as it thinks about creating more capacity. There would possibly be a need to continue to support certain sections of society because we want it to be equal growth, not just growth, but equal growth. I think there will be some need for subsidization, etc. there, like we have heard about the food subsidy bill, which will continue till December 23. I think some of that will have to be budgeted. I think few other things which are also critical is that, as interest rates continue to rise, we need to figure out ways and means of enabling businesses to, for instance, pool capital, right? I mean, we have structures, and over a period of time we have made changes to them. But let's also be now cognizant that the interest rates are now very, very high, higher than the time when some of these policies came in. So cash pooling, can that be allowed? And can you take away some of the aberrations which may be there? Because after almost zero interest rates for a little while, India Inc. will now have to deal with the interest rates which are higher. And it is paradoxical that when one is thinking of revival of the capital cycle, it will come at a higher cost. Let me also say that will also go for the government, because the government will have to pay more interest on public debt, which is raised at higher costs.
Absolutely. We sometimes miss that important point. My very final question, any hope of axe the tax by the Finance Minister and Prime Minister Narendra Modi this year? Well, or should we kind of steel ourselves?
Well, I think difficult for me to comment on that, but looks I don't know how that happens really. So
okay, that's a big if. Whether it will happen, whether it will happen midterm, whether it could happen in the last or in the final interim budget of this term of the Modi government, but axing the tax is perhaps one of the biggest demands when it comes to the Aam Aadmi. We'll see what happens on that, and we'll connect with Sanjeev Kishan once again around budget time. But Sanjeev, many thanks for taking out the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we discussed India and its place in the world. Thank you very much. And with that, it's a wrap on this conversation. If you've been, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.